Okay, so let's see, where are we? Okay, so this is Module 3, Video 4, Disruption in Detroit. This is the case study. So this is a history that goes back, kind of to the beginning. They actually do talk about a bit of the history of Ford. And I love some of the quotes that they put in here. If I asked them what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So there's a lot of really great Henry Ford quotes in this case study that really give you a feeling for what it was like during the fluid phase of Ford. So obviously Henry Ford as the founder was there at the very beginning, and that is the time when the company, the organization is very malleable, lots of changes taking place, and you see that in these quotes. Be ready to revise any system, scrap any method, abandon any theory if the success of the job requires it. So you see in him that passion for success and getting the job right and getting to the goal. So I think there's a lot of great things to think about when you're talking about what a founder means to a company. And it's kind of unusual because you wouldn't necessarily see these as being something that that held on for 100 years. So it gives you some view into where Henry Ford was at the very beginning. So we begin the case study by talking about new competitors, Google, Apple, Tesla, and during the time of the writing of this this case study, there was a lot of controversy about whether or not these were actually competitors or not. So they're stating it as a competitor, and maybe by 2016 they definitely were looked at that way. But earlier than that, Mark Fields was still the CEO, but it was tough for him to get people to get their head around the idea that Google and Apple and Tesla were real competitors. The case study mentions that Mark is a Harvard grad and had an enormous amount of respect for Clay Christensen, who is dubbed the Doctor of Disruption, and he was teaching at that time. So it was something that I think really was internalized by Mark Fields, that this disruption was absolutely taking place, and Ford needed to make some changes in order to stay relevant. The other things that were taking place at the time: sophisticated capabilities like autonomous driving, electric batteries, and infotainment in the vehicle. These are all things that that at the time were relatively new things to Ford, and things that they really had a hard time understanding and getting their head around how they were going to manage it. So the history, they go back and talk about the 80 plus competitors that competed for the automotive vehicle dominant design. When you read Utterback, it's going to be more like 120 different competitors that were in place. You had steam engines and electric engines, and of course the internal combustion engine, which became the dominant design. Ford designed a simple vehicle for the masses. This was Henry Ford's desire to capture that middle class. Anybody who had a reasonable job should be able to have a car and enjoy it with his family. And Ford became part of FDR's arsenal of democracy. During the war, they produced 1 bomber an hour on the assembly line. So obviously that was a huge advantage for the U.S. to have, the technology available in the assembly line. After the war, they expanded into Europe and other regions. Of course, the iconic trucks were introduced and, kind of took off from there. Ford has always, for many years, the F-150 has been the #1 truck in the country, maybe even in the world. It might even be a global achievement. They talk about the 70s and 80s and the Japanese competition. This was when the smaller cars were introduced, and this was a tough thing for Ford and the other American vehicle manufacturers as well. The Japanese had a tough time during this time with quality. This was a development time for the Japanese, but by the late 90s they had worked through that. and they had not only moved into the small cars, but had moved up the curve into SUVs and larger vehicles. So they had worked through their quality issues, as we well know, and became, the quality standard. During this time, Ford moved into their SUV surge. This was an area where people were very excited to have, all the room in an SUV, and it still seems to be, one of the vehicles that people like. They're, the crossovers are, of course, are a little smaller, but, still the whole dynamic of that. And they talk about Mullally, One Ford, and the brilliance of mortgaging the company during this time. So this is the time when General Motors and Chrysler went out of business, or not went out of business. They declared bankruptcy and needed to be bailed out by the government. And Mullally at the time had mortgaged the assets of the company, including the iconic blue oval. But he had, billions of dollars with which to work during this very, very difficult time. And Ford was very respected for their moves during this time. Mullally as, a great leader of change during this period. In addition, the disruption to the powertrain, you have a lot of electric vehicles coming in, and while Ford did have electric vehicles, this was kind of a different way of looking at it. The range, the innovation within the Tesla vehicles, this was a huge disruption during this period. And then software, entertainment, infotainment in the vehicle, the ability to for the riders versus the drivers, and the impact of this on the millennials rather, and the Generation Z. Autonomous vehicles, a huge disruption during this period. Lots of new competitors coming in, non-consumers. So we'll talk about this more in the Utterback section, but disruption often comes from non-consumers. So when you go out, this is the, if I ask them what they wanted, they'd say a faster horse. When you go to your regular customers and say, hey, what would you think about a vehicle that drove itself? And people are like, what are you talking about? Why would you want that? I love driving my car. I love having my own car. Those people are your key customers. They're not going to tell you about a disruption. But you go to a senior citizen that had to surrender their car because they drove through the back of their garage, which happened to my Aunt Nina, and she had to give up her car. And you say, what would you think about having a vehicle that drives itself? It's perfectly safe. You'll be fine. It may take a little bit, but you're going to get her attention because you're going to give her back her freedom, and children. And then also the safety aspects of autonomous vehicles, where, obviously now we're kind of going through a period where we're trying to figure this out. But the whole idea behind it is that, the computers will make better decisions than a distracted driver. There was a statistic I looked up just today that 1.3 million people die every year in car accidents. And the majority of it, I think it was like 93%, are due to distracted drivers. So this is a huge issue, and autonomous vehicles are hoping to contribute to solving that problem. Car ownership and use, another big disruption. So things like Zipcar, where you just jump in and run off when you need it. A huge thing for the automotive companies that want us to buy our own vehicle, which I'm all in favor of. This is a disruption. We don't want this to happen, right? So we've got to deal with the fact that there are generations of people coming along that are perfectly comfortable just borrowing a car. And then, of course, the small car challenge. So we have the growing global middle class, two-thirds that will become two-thirds of the car market, and half the vehicle sales will happen in emerging markets. So how do we address having a car for these markets? This is a big deal. We'll go through more of it in just a couple slides. So the responses to disruption that Mark Fields put in place. So Ford Smart Mobility Incorporated, which he located in Palo Alto. This is a regular response to a disruptive innovation, and we will learn about that as we go forward. I think it's module 4 and 5, maybe 5. So we're going to learn about disruptive responses, and you guys probably got some of this from Nancy Philippart's class. There's a couple readings, I think, Chartu and Marketies, I think she had you read that, and those are great. Those are great responses. So what Mark Fields did was right out of the playbook. So you don't put a Ford Smart Mobility unit in the middle of Ford Engineering. You break it off. You make it a skunk works. You put it someplace where it can make its own decisions, and they're not encumbered by the organization, the culture, things like that. And you know, from a Ford Smart Mobility perspective, they're looking, instead of unit sales, they're looking at miles traveled. So how do we change the way we even think about the way that people use our product? This is easier for, Ford Smart Mobility, because they started off thinking about it that way, rather than Ford, which is, completely, all the business takes place around unit sales. The importance of powertrain flexibility. So electric, hybrid electric, different types of fuels, all of these things are part of, making the vehicle and Ford much more agile. And then software, looking at the vehicle as a cloud computing platform, looking at things that are beamed in from satellites, or, using modems, or brought in using the phone, or built in. So different ways that Ford is looking at how to get software and technology and infotainment into the vehicle. Teaming, there was a piece on teaming with Amazon Echo, where the car can talk to the Amazon system and turn lights on and turn temperatures up, and the Amazon system can start the car. So using voice, really nice way to connect our devices. And then app link to voice control smartphones. So again, this is part of distracted driver. How do we make vehicles with cell phones in them safer? And then autonomous vehicles. Ford is looking at combining some of the autonomous features like parking assist, lane keeping assist, traffic alerts, pedestrian detection, and making the vehicle safer as we're getting to autonomous. So how can we use some of these features that help us to still be safe, even if we are distracted by our phone, even if we are distracted by something going on outside the car? The Velodyne partnership. A lot of these things are really important. Partnerships during this time are very important. Companies have a core competency that they are really good at, and there's no need these days, because of like open software technology, that we can leverage other types of innovations and bring them into our product without reinventing the wheel. So why would we do something when we can partner with other companies that can do it? So Amazon is an example of that. The Velodyne piece of it is an example of that, where we're leveraging technology that's available outside and bringing it in to make our vehicle better. And then Ford feels like they're kind of on the edge of dealing with the government, making sure that as these autonomous vehicles become available, that government regulations support them and provide a gateway.